Okay, everyone, let's get started. Good afternoon, Torontonians, Montrealers, those joining us from other places too. Welcome to our Zoom program featuring two of the most brilliant and accomplished minds in the Jewish world today, Natan Sharansky and Professor Gil Troy. It's a true honor having them joining us so that we can learn from them and learn in particular about their new work. Here it is next to me, Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People. It is a book that Professor Troy has described as a memoir festo, describing the story of a man, but also the ideas and the insights that have animated his life and his journey. Today's program is brought to you in a spirit of collaboration between two communities. My name is Rabbi Jared Grover. I'm the senior rabbi of Beth Tikva Synagogue in Toronto, a conservative synagogue, and I am thrilled to be joined by my colleague, Rabbi Lisa Grushko, senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel Beth Shalom, a Reform synagogue in Montreal. Given our speaker's role in cultivating Jewish peoplehood across ideological divides, I thought it would be particularly fitting to host this conversation with the same spirit. The format of this program will be as follows. Rabbi Grushko, myself, will first give brief introductions of our speakers. Together, we've come up with questions that speak to the book and the relevance of its ideas to the challenges we believe the Jewish people face increasingly today. We'll ask those questions first and hear from our speakers, and then we'll give you as well, honored guests on Zoom, an opportunity also to ask questions. You can do so using the chat function, which is on the Zoom platform. Just submit those questions on the chat board anytime. Make sure that I receive them. And I will try and collate them together and submit them to our speakers, time permitting. And Rabbi Groshko is going to conclude the program with some concluding thoughts and reflections. Let me first introduce a man who needs no introduction, Natan Sharansky, human rights activist, author, a leader in the movement to gain rights for Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel, an Israeli politician who served as a minister and a deputy minister for 4 successive Israeli governments, and chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel from 2009 to 2018. A recipient of dozens of awards, including the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Genesis Prize, and Pras Yisrael. He currently serves as the chairman of the Institute of the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I should also say, because of family connections to Beth Tikva, someone who personally motivated our synagogue's efforts in the years of the struggle to free Soviet Jewry, and someone who has been a great guest and a wonderful friend to our shul over the years. Rabbi Grushko.
It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Gil Troy, but also Rabbi Grover. I want to thank you for extending the invitation to do this as a partnership. I think it's very much in keeping both with the approach of our synagogues, with the approach of the book, and of course with our connections personally, you having grown up at Temple in Montreal, me having grown up at Beth Tikva in Toronto. So Professor Troy is the author of 9 books on the American presidency and 3 books on Zionism, both topics which, one has something to say something about, especially these days, I imagine. Very much top of mind, both of those topics. His educational roots are at Harvard, first as a student, his doctorate from there, and then beginning his teaching career. But since he has been professor at McGill since 1990, we proudly claim him as our own here in Montreal, even though as, I hope you don't mind my quoting you, a meteorological Zionist, he currently lives in Jerusalem, and very, very wisely so. He is, though, still a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, consistently spoken of as one of the great teachers and professors of the university. He is widely published and sought out as a commentator and columnist in the US, in Canada, in Israel, and really in a way that is a role model, I would say. His work goes far beyond the ivory tower to be the model of a scholar who is very much engaged in and involved in improving the issues and contributing to the communities that he cares about. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful partnership of Natan Sharansky and Professor Gil Troy that we have today. So I have the pleasure of starting us off. And with your permission, I'll draw a little bit on personal history and Beth Tikva history here. One of my earliest vivid memories is of being on that bus of 77 people, two buses, I think, which Beth Tikva sent to Ottawa in 1985 to rally for Soviet Jewry. And it was a couple years later, and it is my mother, Ricky Greshko, who I have to thank for holding on to everything. I was twinned with Yulia Brodsky, who was a refusenik at the time from Donetsk, which is a familiar place to Natan Sharansky, of course. And then in July 87, I had a letter from the Committee for Soviet Jewry saying that Yulia Brodsky had left the USSR, had succeeded in leaving. And so I bring those pieces forward, first of all, to acknowledge how much so many of our stories intersect with the story of this movement for Soviet Jewry, and how much, Natan Sharansky, you were really a galvanizing force and an inspiration for so many of us. But also it occurs to me when we think about connections between Jews around the world, that after this letter, of course, I know nothing of Yulia Brodsky, my twin, what happened to her, where she went to, what her life was. And I wonder whether in all of the projects that you've undertaken to connect different parts of the Jewish world, whether you've thought about ways of reigniting some of those connections that were forged 40 years ago, 30 years ago, between specific Jews in North America and Jews in the former USSR.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for asking this important question. Yes, it's interesting that this global struggle, the unique struggle, the most successful struggle in the 20th century, the struggle which started from this small group of Jews in the Soviet Union who wanted to leave and turned into the struggle of all the world, in fact, to open the Iron Curtain, which finished with opening the Iron Curtain, with falling Soviet Union, with 2 million Jews leaving former Soviet Union, more than 1 million Jews living in Israel. And it all started from the fact that a group of Jews in Soviet Union went back to their identity, suddenly discovered their own identity. And I was one of them who suddenly understood that we can be part of this unique history of Jewish people. And these people from all over the world who are coming as tourists and saying, oh, my father is also from Odessa, like your father, we are a family, that we can have this family and that we can have our state. And we could never survive even one day if it wasn't also immediately, practically, also the struggle of the Jews of the world, who also were very specific people who suddenly rediscovered their own identity. They suddenly found out that they can go back to be active part of their own history by fighting for our release. And so on one hand, it was global, but it was all personal. It was all from this personal connection. In fact, this Toronto Jewish community and your synagogue, it was a good example because the family of my relatives, whom I didn't even know that I have relatives, and they left almost 100 years ago before this former Soviet Union, Odessa. And suddenly they here are reading the newspapers, hearing about Vitaly and her husband who is in prison. And one of them says, well, it must be our family. And they discover that it's really our family. And they become very active, and the community becomes active, and Canadian Jewry becomes active, because in fact, it's one small personal story, but it's all about Jewish people rediscovering that they are one family and fighting together. Now you're asking, what about personal connection? You know, I personally keep a lot of connections with people who were visiting me in Moscow, who were fighting. Now I keep in connection with their children, with their grandchildren. And there are, of course, big projects of how to build more and more interconnections. But I have to say, it has to be personal. If your parents didn't tell you how they were going on demonstrations, how they were going to Russia, how they were smuggling letters, how they were calling to their senators and congressmen. And I was saying not specifically about your family, but unfortunately, that is the situation with the whole generation of American, Canadian Jews who spent 20 years in fighting, who reached this unbelievable victory, and somehow don't tell to their children and grandchildren about their own role in this. And that's really very it's unfortunate.
Okay, I'll take the next question. This is again for you, Natan, because I think you've said before that the easiest time in your life from a moral perspective was the time you spent in prison. But when you became a politician and the chairman of the Jewish Agency, moral purity, as you reveal in the book, becomes much more difficult. You describe a Jewish world today where too many Jews prefer to be in that prison of moral purity rather than in the real world where compromise is important. I want to ask you, does that attitude make bridge building now more difficult than it has ever been? And how do you continue to make arguments for being connected to the big universal struggles and the particular ones to the Jewish people too? Do you worry that you have lost some of your moral high ground because of your political pursuits and some of the right-wing associations when it comes to the Palestinian issue?
Well, you ask me so many questions in one. It's almost all the book in one question. I'm not sure that I'll be able to answer all of them, but let's start. First of all, about prison. As you said, people prefer to keep them in prison. No, I didn't mean prison in negative meaning of the word. To the contrary, I really say that the most comfortable from moral point of view situation was in prison, because it was so clear, here is enemies and here are friends. Here is good and here is wrong. I say no to KGB, and I had to say every day to decide whether I'll continue saying no to KGB or will start making compromises with them. But by saying no to KGB, I do all my Taryag mitzvot, all my 613 obligations. Well, you rabbis know how it is almost impossible, practically impossible to demand from anybody, including ourselves, to do all 613 commandments. And here in prison, you really feel that you fulfilled all your obligations, because what else you can do to the cause? You feel yourself part of the struggle. It's so easy to feel yourself in the center of the struggle. The questions are put by your enemies, the answers are clear, and what is maybe the most important, that it's clear that all those huge disagreements, which you faced and you know very well, and in Soviet Jewry movement, those who think there was no disagreements, there was a lot of disagreements. There was a lot of competing organizations. There were a lot of different organizations who were betraying one another and betrayal of the cause. But it is so easy to feel that all of them are fighting the same fight. And it is easy to remind yourself that what unites us is much bigger than what divides us. Now, when you go to the government and to the Jewish agency, the big debate between Israel and or permanent dialogue or debate between Israel and world Jewry, of course there is, you have to make compromises. In fact, the moment you decide to be the leader of the party is only part of the people. So you are losing this unique feeling of connection with all the Jewish people, and you want to restore it. And you cannot restore it different than by making compromises between your party and the other parties and so on. And this, I would say, art of compromise is something which is very difficult for dissidents who used to live without compromises to reach. As to the last group of questions about universalism and particularism, in fact, that's what I learned in Soviet Union when I was at the same time spokesman of the struggle of the Soviet Jews and spokesman of human rights movement. And in spite of the pressure from both sides, choose whether you Are you for your own tribe or you for the rights of all the people? I felt it's absolutely relevant because if I have strength to fight for the rights of all the people, it's only because I discovered my identity, and that is the source of my strength. And I tried to keep this deep connection between identity and freedom through all my life. And that's, in fact, the book shows that yes, it is possible. And whether I'm a right-wing politician or left-wing, let's debate later. In fact, I think I make very strong case in our book with Gil Troy that to be against Oslo Agreement doesn't mean to be a right-wing politician. As the one who just now sat with my partners from Bahrain. And so how, and not so, we were discussing how we were building together a new partnership. So it's the best proof that you don't need to look for some major terrorist allies in the Middle East to build the real peace. Okay.
Thank you. You know, I think that one of the things that comes through so clearly in the book is how your experience as a dissident shaped your perspective as a politician and with the Jewish Agency and with everything else. I'm remembering the scene where you describe where you're finally going to freedom and the KGB agents say, go straight. And so you zigzag, right? And so you have that understanding of what it is to be in the position of pushing back and of opposing. And so this brings me to the question of Zionism and Israel and pluralism. Both Rabbi Grover and I are passionate Zionists. We represent large communities in Canada, which are full of Jews who have been to Israel, who love Israel, who are engaged with Israel. And we, both of us, you know, as rabbis, as people, really support this notion of Israel as the homeland for all Jews. And then we have this challenge, of course, which you know very well, which is what happens when the place that you see as your home doesn't acknowledge or accept you or see you as legitimate. This is very relevant right now. I just heard this week of one of the converts who I wrote a letter for Aliyah being refused, which has not happened before. Usually for the right of return, these go forward easily. So the question is, you know, you draw out the complexity of this in the book in terms of the Rabbanut and the ultra-Orthodox parties and conversion and diaspora Jewry and so on. But the question that I have is, given what you describe of how any Israeli government depends on coalitions with these ultra-Orthodox parties who are not willing to be in the conversation about opening up religious status and identity, what do you see as the way forward for those of us who are passionate Zionists and also passionate pluralists?
Well, first of all, my position is clear on this. In the book, I describe my first meetings with the non-Orthodox rabbis in Moscow, and how on one hand, I was surprised to see the rabbi without kippah, and on the other hand, how unimportant these differences were, because it was clear that we are in the same journey, we one people. And let's say that the moment you see KGB tails just near you, you understand how unimportant these differences is. So this, having come with this feeling to Israel, yes, I felt for many years how it is important to fight for pluralistic approach, for including every Jew, that not every Jew will feel himself or herself at home. Now, as you could see in my book, my complaint or my criticism is not about ultra-Orthodox, because they say the same thing before elections and after elections. They don't recognize non-Orthodox streams. You know what? It is their right as long as the state is not accepting it. After all, they are minority. They are a relatively small minority. For majority of Israelis take a very different position. And majority of Israelis, this all is our Jewish family. But my criticism is about Zionist parties, Labor and Likud, first of all, because they are those who are saying one thing before elections and another thing after elections. And well, the reason for this, no, is very simple. Ben-Gurion when asked by Reform Jews, some representatives, when Israel finally solve this problem, he said, it sounds like cynical, but it's real political answer. He said, well, if there'll be 300,000 Reform Jews, of course, we will solve this problem. I cannot accept it simply because I think even if there is one Jew who doesn't feel that he's welcome to Israel, we have to change it. But politician who has to fight all the time for his or her seat in the Knesset, I can understand it. And the only answer can be that for Israelis who are not part of ultra-Orthodox, small ultra-Orthodox minority, it must be enough important that there will be high priority that their those whom they are voting for will have to make this change. And I think these changes happening with Israelis. It doesn't happen in one day. I, as a head of Jewish agency, I could work a lot on this, and we have to continue working on this. And I have to say, you also can work on it. Israelis have to see, to understand much more the nature of this majority of Jewish communities. The fact that for many Israelis, non-Orthodox Jewish communities, that's the way to escape from Judaism and not the way to come back to Judaism. It's simply a lot of arrogance, a lot of lack of knowledge. So there is a lot of work to do, but yes, we have to fight and to be tough with the politicians, and at the same time to build a lot of bridges between Israelis and between Jewish communities of the world. But maybe Gil has something to add on this.
Look, it's very interesting the way we approach things. And I think it gets to what Rabbi Grover was asking about the kind of moral purity that everybody wants to hold on to these days. And to the extent that we accept complexity, to the extent that we see that there are multi-dimensions in the conversation about Israel, about Zionism, about Canada even, the capital of niceness, we can go in, we can find different ways in, and then indeed we can feel empowered to make changes. So on the question, let's zero in on the Kotel question. And both of us are very clear in this book and in our lives that we want to make sure that the Kotel, the Western Wall, is a resource for all the Jewish people, and that the Jewish people understand that it is a shared platform for identity building, for celebration. But when I do my work with Birthright, at the height of the Kotel controversy, I turned to the Birthright survey experts and I said, well, tell me, what are the students saying? What are the participants saying? Are they saying that they're so put off by the controversy that they only see the Kotel in sectarian terms? And in fact, the polls have been consistent, and the personal feedback we've gotten, Natan and I, from speaking to Birthright participants, they come to the Kotel and they don't see it through that lens of conflict. They don't see it through that lens of critique. They see the spiritual highlight of their journey, the spiritual highlight of their life. And sometimes we educationally get so caught up in the fight, we educationally get so caught up in the critique that we forget that we now have generations, very especially a young generation of Jews, especially if we go outside of the amazing infrastructure that we see in Montreal and Toronto, where so many of your young people are in Jewish day school. And we go out to the United States of America, and also outside of Montreal and Toronto, Winnipeg, we see so many young Jews come to Israel ignorant. And if we start with the challenges, if we start with the headaches, if we start with the problems, rather than starting with the power of Never Alone, the power of the platform, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And one of the things we're trying to do in the book is invite people into dialogue, not ignore the problems, but also put it in a broader context. And that goes back to one of the things that Natan was saying, which is that even in the Soviet Jewish movement, it's true we all yelled, "Shlach et ami," let my people go. But some came from the Orthodox perspective, some came from the secular perspective. There were Reform Jews, there were conservative Jews, and sometimes they fought like cats and dogs. And sometimes the refuseniks had to smuggle the same document to two different parts of Fifth Avenue in New York because two organizations with very similar sounding names wouldn't talk to one another. So we're very good at fighting one another. What we have to remember is that skill of uniting with one another as well.
Well, Professor Troy, it's a great segue to my next question, which is about Jewish education. You know Canadian Jewry. There was a study last year that revealed that our community has strong emotional connections to Israel, much more than the United States. And yet this past summer, it was a Canadian actor, Seth Rogen, who stoked controversy when he announced on a radio show, and I quote, I was fed a huge amount of lies about Israel. What do you think about his claim? Is there something wrong with the way we're teaching our kids about Israel? Is there something that's leaving them unprepared for college and beyond? And what can we do to make, as a Jewish community, what can we do to help make college campuses places where Jewish students aren't afraid to be themselves and also don't feel like they were being lied to in their earlier educational experiences? What are your thoughts?
Look, this is a very serious challenge. And again, one of the things we talked about in the last third of the book, which is about identity building. And let's first step back and talk about a vision, right? When Natan talks about identity and freedom, think about freedom as opening the door, opening the gate, and identity as your particular GPS, your particular roadmap. And what we're trying to do is build a conversation about Israel, about Zionism, about Jewish identity, which is about that, not saying that we're dictating how one should think. In fact, the very idea of freedom is you should be the captain of your own ship. You should chart your own course. But we're also saying you're heirs to this amazing conversation about who we can be as individuals and as a community, about moral dimensions to our lives, about finding a life that's more meaningful than the me, my, more, now of today's shopping experiences, that we're part of something bigger. And my critique of too much Jewish education is that all too often too much Israel education is we're so scarred by the attacks on us. We're so scarred by the conflict, but we also kind of find it somewhat attractive because that's the way to get the blood boiling, that we start teaching about Israel through conflict rather than start teaching about Israel through the basics. And look, I have tremendous appreciation for the many years I spent in Canada, for my Toronto family and my Montreal family. And it's really because to be a part of the Canadian Jewish community, nobody's friends, we're just family. It's a real deep sense of connectedness. And I'm so proud of that study that came out. I wrote about it in the Canadian Jewish News, Alav Shalom, about how you really saw what I call Pilates Judaism. Core, that Canadians have a sense of the core strength. Canadian Jews compared to American Jews are far more fluent. Much higher percentage have been to Israel once, twice, 3 times, average 5 times. Many of them have been through the Jewish education system. But it's so important that we make sure that our Jewish education and our Israel education doesn't become what I sometimes call, to be controversial, a form of child abuse. It can't be through the guilt trip. It has to be through the Jewish journey. It can't just be through, these are talking points, and this is Israel advocacy, but it has to be through, this is the vision, and this is the possibility. And we'll get to Israel advocacy once we've built our identity. But I'm afraid that Professor Rogan over there in Hollywood wasn't giving us a thoughtful, considered critique. I'm hijacking some of the things he said in order to give my critique. What he was doing was simply going with the pile on against Israel. What he was doing was simply going with the fact that I have my finger to the wind, and it's politically correct to say, oh, I'm Jewish, but I'm not going to be Zionist. I'm going to be part of the Hollywood Tikkun Olamists, maybe, and talk about universalism, but I'm not going to do that ugly form of particularism, not understanding that the best way to do Tikkun Olam, the best way to give back to the world, is first know who you are, Pilates. First have a strong sense of self. And I'm very sorry that we allow the shriek of the Hollywood celebrities to define the conversation and to set the tone rather than the substance of people like Natan Sharansky who devoted their lives to it. And that's the challenge of the book. We're trying to say, look, maybe it's not a soundbite. Maybe it takes a paragraph. Maybe it takes a chapter. Maybe it takes 470 pages, but sit, roll up your sleeves and learn. And let's talk about it. Let's discuss it.
Natan, do you have thoughts on that question? You've been traveling around to many campuses while you were chairman of Jewish Agency, even now. What do you see when you, in your encounters with students? Is Seth Rogen's view representative of the views of many young Jews today?
Well, first time I heard this view in Toronto, in York University, at the time of the second Intifada. All the people remember what the second Intifada and how 15 years ago, 17 years ago, how every week another 20 people were killed in the cafe or the bus station. So, and we were in the middle of the struggle against terrorism. And there was a lot of accusations of Israel violating the human rights of Palestinians. And I'm traveling through universities. The first university was York University. And the young student says, for me as a liberal Jew, it will be better if Israel doesn't exist. That's, in fact, that's I understood then how big is the problem on the campuses. Then I met this problem many times. And then when I launched then the program of sending shlichim, representatives of young Israelis, to the campuses, which today is one of the most successful programs of Jewish agency. But I don't, well, of course, so then I was more than 100 universities. I spoke with many students who are ardent Zionists. I spoke with some students who are like that young guy who says how for him is problematic that Israel exists. But what is most frightening, and I was excited and positive about many things, but what's most frightening that then for the first time I started seeing the phenomena which became normal today. There is more and more double thinkers, people who do think very positively about Israel, but are afraid to say it publicly. As one girl from Harvard University, from business school, Harvard University, told me that she knows that if she'll sign this letter against boycott of Israel, 3 of her professors will not like it, and it can damage her career. That's why she preferred for the next year at least to be silent. I thought, my God, I hear it not in Moscow University, not in the times of Iron Curtain, I hear it in Harvard from young Jewish students. And of course, today we have many polls, how many, not only Jews, but also young Jews prefer to hide their views. And that's something which should not be in free society. That's double think is the phenomenon of fear society. And what I'm saying always to our shlichim, to young Israelis, is your aim is not to prove to our enemies that we are not as bad as they think. It's not so important. Your aim is to prove to young Jews that they have nothing to be ashamed of being connected to Israel. They can criticize Israel, they can disagree with one another policy. Everybody disagrees with the policy of his or her government. But there is a lot of things to be proud of, that you're connected to this unique state and these unique people.
Thank you.
You know, I would love if you wouldn't mind to stay with this just for a moment more, Rabbi Grover. Is it okay by you?
Of course.
Because I was so struck by what you wrote about the difference between fear culture and a free culture and how important that is. And one of the things that those of us who go to Israel a lot notice is how much conversation there is, how much argument, how much debate, how much room there is for different political opinions. Whereas in many of our diaspora communities, right, there is more of a party line. And so the young Jews I speak to on campus say they're afraid to be progressive in Jewish circles, in the organized Jewish community, and they're afraid to be Jewish in progressive circles. And so we've spoken about the second part of that. I wonder if the two of you have thoughts on the first part, on what we can do within the organized Jewish community to make more room for Jews who identify as progressive to feel like they also have a place and a voice at the table.
Gil, you start.
Sure. 2 things. First of all, I mean, the essence of the book really starts with the notion of dialogue. And it's not just a dialogue between Israel and the diaspora, but it really is a dialogue between left and right, between religious and non-religious. And we try to give tools. I mean, one of the beautiful metaphors, everybody's now talking about the Queen's Gambit. And Natan talks about being not just in prison, not just in the Gulag for 9 years, not just having many months in solitary confinement, but 405 days in a punishing cell. And how does he keep sane? How does he entertain himself? He plays chess in his head. And after winning, because he's playing, he would turn the chess board around in his head and replay it. And that's a metaphor about our not needing to agree on everything. We don't need uniformity. We don't need unanimity, but we need unity. And that's an invitation for us to have that kind of dialogue. In my previous book, the Zionist ideas, I literally took a book from 1959, The Zionist Idea, this notion that there is a party line. And I added an S. And what I love about the S is it opens up the conversation, left, right, religious, non-religious. And also the S is not an exclamation point, it's a question mark. And that actually goes back to the earlier question also about how we teach. The more we teach with questions, not just with exclamation points, the more we teach with conversational points, not talking points. The more we teach in a way that is fluid and open, the better we'll have a chance to make people understand that, look, Zionism means A, we are a people, not just a religion. B, we have rights to a particular homeland, doesn't preclude others from having rights to that homeland. And C, we have the right to establish a state on that homeland like 192 other countries in the United Nations have done for themselves. And when people say they're anti-Zionist, I say, which one of those things are you choosing to negate in my identity search? And so I think, yes, sometimes the Jewish community has shot itself in the foot, but I also know that we're often caricatured. I can't tell you how many times I've been in the holy of holies of Jewish organizations. It could be the American Jewish Committee or the federations or the GA, and I'm sitting at a table and somebody from the left says, "We don't have a space at the table. We're never invited." I said, "This is the table. This is what it looks like." And this is what Natan was saying earlier. You've got a problem. Stand up and solve it. I often feel that the Jewish community is caricatured. I often feel the Zionist conversation is caricatured. One of the things I tried to do with that book was launch Zionist salons. And I saw it at universities, in federations, in over 200 places where I had these Zionist salons. If you invite people into a conversation that isn't about Bibi and isn't about BDS and isn't about the Gil trip, but is about identity and who we can be, they're excited. And that was also Natan's central mission in the Jewish Agency, going from the guilt trip to the opportunity, going from an aliyah of necessity to an aliyah of choice. And so that's what we're trying to do with the book, but also as educators and activists to change the tone, but also to stop us being caricatured. Natan?
Yeah, well, I'll try to bring one specific aspect to this problem. For many years, when I was in the government, I had to deal with the fact that each time when you are saying, well, your attacks on Israel are anti-Semitic, they say, no, you try to stop legitimate criticism of Israel by calling it anti-Semitism. And because at some moment it became more obvious than when they say that Israel created Auschwitz, or that the best caricature in Europe is Israeli Prime Minister eating Palestinian children. That reminds me, anti-Semitism, I proposed 3 Ds, which today became international definition, that demonization, delegitimization, double standard towards Israel, exactly as the legitimization of the demonization of Jews for 1,000 years, that's new anti-Semitism. And very often I hear, no, but that restricts our freedom of criticism or freedom of speech. I say, you know what? Criticize Israel without demonizing Israel, because the beauty of this definition is that it also gives you a lot of space to criticize Israel. And I'm fully for the fact that people who disagree will find a way to express their criticism without demonization of Israel, without calling Israel Nazi state, without denying the right of Israel to exist. And why it is so difficult? It's so good for our dialogue. If when somebody says, no, I really believe you are apartheid state. And I say, why? Because you have a wall. Then why we have a wall? Let's discuss. And then he said that I don't like the fact that the Palestinians have to wait so long for the checkpoints. Okay, that's already a different thing. You know, many of us also disagree and think that we have to do it better. But that the moment you agree that there must be some criteria when criticism turns into anti-Semitism, it's much easier to agree about the free criticizing your own state and your own people and disagreeing. And of course, it's absolutely necessary for continuing our journey together. And if we are speaking about it, I have to say on Friday, I was sitting with the delegation from Bahrain, from the Institute for Religious Tolerance, the institute which signed 1 month ago with American administration, with State Department, memorandum of understanding that they will fight together anti-Semitism in all its forms, including anti-Zionism and the legitimization of Israel. And I am sitting at this meeting, and I read the text, and I'm very careful. Maybe they wanted so much to sign this agreement with Americans, though it didn't really read or didn't feel sensitivity. And when I brought this topic, they said, of course, we wanted it because we want to build now good relations with the state of Israel. So if for them it is obvious that there must be limits in which you can criticize Israel when it becomes anti-Semitic. So why it should not be obvious and clear to liberal Jewish community who has its serious disagreements, with some of which I agree, some of which I don't agree with Israel. And the moment we agree that it should not turn into anti-Semitic speech, well, the more criticism, the more free discussion, the better.
And if I can just add one more point, the single dumbest conversation that's going on in the Jewish community today, and we have a long list, is this ridiculous conversation between what's worse, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism. And first of all, what we see is that left-wingers are always yelling and screaming about campus anti-Semitism, and right-wingers are always yelling about left-wing anti-Semitism. Fix your own problems. And anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. We need a clear red line. And if we as a community can't even unite against our enemies, if we as a community can't even say, you know what, I'm going to put my partisan disagreements aside on this and fight together, and also make sure that I call out my own allies, then where are we? And so we really have to assert leadership in that way and say enough with it. Not everything is partisan. Not everything is reduced to left versus right. And sometimes we need to say, bigotry, it's not just that I'm against anti-Semitism, I'm against bigotry of all forms. And I need clear red lines, and I need people policing themselves.
Thank you for that. I think along with many of the other things that come up in the book, whether it's the image of playing chess rather than checkers, or the 3Ds of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, it's very, very helpful to have these ideas to come out with. And it's one of the reasons I think the book is such a valuable discussion starter. So I will give the last question from me and Rabbi Grover, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. There's a charming part near the end, Natan, where you say that Avital keeps asking you when you're going to retire, and you said you did in 2018, and she says, I didn't notice. But you talk about how things really had to stop, or at least change, with Corona. And you share what turned into this very popular YouTube clip, recognizing the irony of the difference between our situation in our homes and your situation in your cell. Clearly, these are entirely different worlds. But you still manage to tap into these questions that I think are in the whole book about how do you have a sense of meaning and purpose and endurance. So I wonder whether you could both share your insights in terms of how we make it through this time, and also how we perhaps keep some of that solidarity and sense of meaning when, God willing, we're on the other side of all this.
Well, I think it's very simple. First of all, we have all to remember that we are in the war. With the war with invisible enemy, but a very dangerous one, which threatens to once in 100 years comes on this earth. And we are soldiers. And in fact, the more you understand that you're a soldier who has a role in this battle, that your behavior, it's not simply that you have to keep the social distancing and that you cannot see your grandchildren as easily as you could do it before, that there is a special meaning, because that's what contributes to our victory. It becomes easy. And that's what I said in the very beginning of this corona. And I still think people who remind themselves that there is a very important meaning in their personal behavior, it's easier for them to accept these restrictions. Second thing I was saying, don't try to build your agenda or your hopes on the things which don't depend on you. In prison, if I was building all my hope that how I'll survive physically, depended only on KGB, then I will be lost. And I had to decide it's not my aim. I should not think about it, how I'll survive physically. I should think how I'll stay free person here. And that depended only on me. So don't make your plans, oh, in 2 weeks, we'll finally be able to travel to Miami or to Israel, to where. It doesn't depend on you. But you can plan that in the next months you will study, learn another language, or will read the book that you want, and make it very tough for yourself, but make it very challenging. But these plans which depend on you. So never stop laughing on the stage, on yourself. Thanks God, there are thousands of jokes on the internet, in Hebrew, in English, in Russian, in Ukrainian, other languages I don't read. Enjoy them. It's the moment you can laugh on yourself and the absurdity of the situation, you're above it, you're in control of it. And the most important thing is we Jews, we had internet forever, for 1,000 years. We were small communities, disconnected, but we somehow felt ourselves well connected. Corona, in fact, reminds all of us how important is your home. My home is my fortress. How important is your family? How important is your community? This about community. And at the same time, it reminds all of us that there are enemies that we can defeat only with all the world together. Only if there are no walls between China and America and Russia, we can successfully defeat. So what is a better message Kadosh Baruch Hu can send us, that our particularism, our community, our family is important, and our universalism is important. That's what I think about Corona.
And one of the central themes of the book is we've got to leave this land of false choices. We have to stop being forced between universalism and particularism, liberalism or nationalism. Natan, when he was in the Soviet Union, worked hand in glove with Andrei Sakharov, the great human rights dissident, and to improve the Soviet Union and ultimately shake it to its core, and also the emigration movement of refuseniks. And we're always feeling in the modern world that we have to choose one or the other, and that's a huge mistake. And fundamentally, the lesson I hope people will remain with them will be this notion of never alone. You know, the book was originally called 999 because of Natan's 9 years in the Gulag, 9 years in Israeli politics, and 9 years in the Jewish Agency. And we literally signed a contract, 999, but I didn't like it because, first of all, you can't have a book that's an inside joke. Also, I worried about my Christian friends who might think of it 666, and my German friends would go 999. So we're sitting with, I'm sitting with a friend of mine in Los Angeles and saying, we need a better title. And he says, well, tell me about the book. And I start telling some of the moments when Natan is in the Gulag year after year. The KGB tells him, you're forgotten, you're abandoned. He doesn't get visitors. He has very little access to even to newspapers. But he says, I knew I was never alone. And my friend says, that's it. It's David Suissa from the Los Angeles Jewish Journal. He says, for 75 years, it's been never again. And of course, and we know how important this is in the Canadian Jewish community, we have to remember and revere our martyrs from the Shoah and honor them. But we can't just be defensive. We can't just be reactive. We can't just be saying never again. We have to say never alone. That when you're a part of this amazing network, this amazing history, this amazing story of the Jewish people, you could be in isolation like my 90-year-old father has been since March. You can be cut off, but you're truly never, never alone. And that's a message that will help sustain many people through this very long, uncertain path out of Corona, and should continue to boost us up, because so many of our young people, especially today, feel so lonely, feel so adrift. You know, in the UK, they have a minister of loneliness. Millennials report how cut off they feel. They have friends on Facebook, but not real friends. And we're saying, you have mishpacha, you have family, you're never alone. Join us. And don't forget, only 12 more days of shopping days till Hanukkah.
And we really are mutually implicated for good and for bad. And that leads to one of the questions that the audience keeps bringing up with me on the chat board, because even here in Canada, we're on alert because of this assassination last week in Iran. The Iranians, they have in the past looked at Jewish communities across the world as targets to revenge killings that happen in the Middle East. So maybe the two of you have something to comment on the situation, the chance of an escalation in this situation with Iran. And also, Professor Troy, are you worried? So we've got a new president coming in, who might bring in some new policies with regards to the American-Iran relationship. Are you concerned, with your background, maybe you can give us some insight about the Biden administration and what its policies will be when it comes to the Iran relationship?
Okay, I will leave to Professor Troy to speak about Biden administration. I'll speak about Israeli government in Iran. And we speak, of course, in the book a lot about it. I will say, Israel is treating Iranian threat very seriously. Benjamin Netanyahu, 20 years ago, decided that he came to politics. He came to be the leader of Israel in order to prevent the Iranian threat. And in the book, we write a lot about my good friend Netanyahu, some positive things which are not wrong, and some very critical things, especially about his last years. But I have to say, it is definitely to his great credit that he was the first in the world who understood how dangerous it is, and he was the first in the world almost 20 years ago, started organizing economical sanctions against Iran. Now I have to say, as you know, we have a lot of disagreements inside Israel, and around Bibi Netanyahu today, there is a lot of disagreements. Every day there is demonstration. On the question of Iran, whether Shabak, Mossad, everybody, the left and the right, all the specialists, and I was on many meetings in the last 20 years, very secret meetings on this, everybody agrees. There is disagreement about the way how we're dealing with it, whether this country which is not making a secret, that wants to have the weapons of mass destruction in order to destroy Israel. World without Israel, that's their policy, open and closed and secret policy. And there are those in Israel who believe that in the end we'll have to attack. There are those in Israel, among the specials, who believe that it is only economical sanctions. There are those people who believe that there can be, with the time, change of regime. There are people who believe that we have to deal specifically against those who are developing the weapons of mass destruction and prepared for using. And so there are disagreements, but in the end, all the options are on the table. I know as much as you about this specific thing which happened, whether it was Israel, whether it was America, whether it was some inner forces, I don't know. I can tell you, the strategy of Israel is that we should not permit them to have an opportunity to destroy us. And we do know for sure, 100%, that they have full determination to do it. That's what I can tell.
It's a great question that balances some of the questions earlier, because we often talk about how Israel lets down diaspora Jewry with the questions of pluralism. We also have to talk about how sometimes diaspora Jewry lets down Israel. And many Israelis are befuddled by the soft spot that especially American Jews tend to have over the Iran issue and on the Iran deal. And many Israelis say, hey, wait a minute, this is an existential threat, not just to little Satan, which is Israel, but to big Satan, which is the United States of America and the free world. And how come American Jews in particular cannot see that? 60, 70% who supported the Iran deal. How come liberals who are anti-nukes somehow, when it comes to the Iranian nuclear program, have a soft spot for it? So there's a hypocrisy that Israelis feel that is very, very threatening to them. That's one dimension. When we talk about Joe Biden's administration, and first of all, we should wish him luck, because we all know, both as Canadians and Israelis, that if the United States does well, then the Western world does well, and we all do well. Let me share two thoughts. One is that I truly, truly hope, and it gets back to Natan and his 3 Ds, that whatever people think of Joe Biden's policies vis-a-vis the Middle East, that we banish that foolish, reductive phrase, anti-Israel, when it comes to criticizing him. If he criticizes the settlements, if he criticizes Bibi Netanyahu, but nevertheless, given the fact that for 47 years that he's been in the Congress and public service, has been such an ardent friend of Israel, that shows exactly that space that Natan was talking about, where you can criticize without demonizing. And I have no desire to recruit more people to the anti-Israel core. As someone who's been at McGill University for many, many years and seen people who truly do hate Israel, who truly are anti-Zionist, who truly anti-Israel, I only use that phrase for the people who truly deserve it. Mm-hmm. So talk about a failure of the Jewish community. Stop using that phrase so broadly, because you recruit the wrong people to the side. So I hope that if we have a robust debate about what Joe Biden does or doesn't do, that phrase is banished. That's number one. But number two, there is concern, and a valid concern, about will Joe Biden, who's going to come and very much say, I'm the anti-Trump, I'm the un-Trump, and Lord knows there's a lot of good reasons for distancing, will he also distance too instinctively, too dramatically from the very important gains that have occurred under the Trump administration, not just recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which American politicians have called for, including George McGovern and Jimmy Carter since the 1970s, but this amazing breakthrough of the Abraham Accords. And I think this is a real challenge for the Biden administration. Can they learn from the mistakes of some of the Oslo peace processors? Or are they simply going to go back to the old hymnal? And I think this is a real opportunity to show, not just in the Middle East, but in general, that some things happened in the last 4 years that weren't all negative. And there's a need to build peace from the bottom up, not from the top down. The road to peace now we see may be through the Gulf states, maybe not certainly through Damascus, but also not through Ramallah. And the Palestinians who continue, especially on campus and elsewhere, to call for anti-normalization and boycott of Israel have shot themselves in the foot. And now we see a normalization. This is an opportunity. And so I really hope that the Biden administration, while sticking to its core principles, will also learn some new things from the last 4 years and from the last 4 or 5 months, which are so exciting in Israel. My friends are so excited about the business ties, the cultural ties, the academic ties. And let's point out one other thing. Natan was talking about his connection with Bahraini people fighting anti-Semitism. Do you know there are still some, unfortunately, American Jewish organizations which won't accept that definition? And I'm happy to say that in Canada, we're starting to see more universities and more municipalities and more governments accept that definition. So let's learn from one another how to have a good Shvil Zahav, a good middle path together, working together, because we're never alone.
Including the Ontario government that passed that definition just a few weeks ago.
I'm sure thanks to many of your good work.
What a substantive conversation. In just 1 hour, we've covered so many different topics. I can't thank you enough. Rabbi Grishko, I'll give you the mic to conclude today's meeting.
Thank you. And I will add that this conversation has been recorded and will be shared through both synagogues for those who want to listen later. But if the sense you got was that we just skimmed the surface of the topics in this book, you are indeed correct. So I will add to the plug. Anyone who knows me knows that if a book's got Post-its in it, it has been well read and enjoyed, and I would recommend it really strongly. When I came to the end of the book, not to elevate it too much, but I think of the words we get to when we reach the end of any book of the Torah, which is chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. May we be strong, may we be strong, may we strengthen one another. And so as I see us all in these little boxes, but joining 2 countries, 2 congregations, and such a long history, I think of those words. May we be strong, may we be strong, may we strengthen one another. And we'll conclude the conversation with an amen. And thank you all so much.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.